Welcome everyone to another episode of the Shaman's Way podcast. As always, this episode comes from the teachings of our amazing friend and shaman in residence, Kriket. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts as much as we enjoy making them, and I'd like to take just a moment to ask you if you would please leave us a rating and a comment in iTunes or whichever podcast player you're listening to us from. Giving us a rating and sharing this podcast with others is the biggest way you can tell us that you like our show. Now, without further ado, on with the episode.
The spirit of addiction. Hello, my constant listeners. Hello to my somewhat new listeners, and a special hello to my very first time listeners. Welcome to Shaman's Way. Some of you know, some of you don't. My name is Kriket, and I want to talk about something that is quite personal for me and has been a shamanic journey for the entire time that I practice shamanism. This episode is dedicated to the spirit of addiction, and it is prompted in part by the opioid crisis that we are seeing in, at least in North America. I don't know a lot about whether there's an opioid crisis in other parts of the world, so I'm sharing with you my ignorance at this point. Don't judge, please. But the spirit of addiction, it has been on my radar because now my constant listeners, you'll know part of this story, so bear with me. But for some people don't know, when I first started my experience with the drumming circle and first started to learn shamanism, I studied with a teacher whose name was Michael, and he was a day supervisor for a program called ADAC, which is Alberta Alcohol and Drug Abuse Commission. So the people who were members of that drumming circle were members because they were ADAC clients, so they had addictions. The addictions ranged everything from hard drugs to gambling to stealing to smoking. But it really ran the gamut. For the first 5 years of my journey with shamanism, many of the people who were in the circle were addicts. And I learned quite a bit about the spirit of addiction, what I came to call the spirit of addiction, as I went through the process of working with addiction and so on and so forth. So from a personal perspective, I have my own addictions. I smoked cigarettes for a good number of years. When I started smoking cigarettes, this is one of those old-timer stories, you know, the kinds you hear when I was a kid. Anyway, when I started smoking, cigarettes were 50 cents a pack, and you could still buy them for your mother or your father. So that was my story, was that I was buying it for a parent. And I really took to smoking, I think, as a way of nurturing my own self or looking cool, or I don't even have a reason why I was such a dumb idiot and started smoking. And it was during a journey, a soul retrieval journey, that I had my lungs ripped out of my body by this alien-looking creature, and it took my lungs and squeezed them out, and all the icky goo and all that other horrible stuff was in my lungs, squeezed it out, and then, opened up my mouth, shoved his fist with these long dark claws and my now clean lungs back in my throat, and looked me square in the eye and said, "Smoke again and I'll kill you." So I kind of gave up smoking. I mean, I've toyed with the idea of going back to it because I smoked for over 20 years and so on and so forth, but my lungs are such baby lungs now. They're healthy lungs now that, to put that in my body, I think would pretty much do me in anyway. The other addiction that I have is an addiction to food as a comfort. Some of you may know, some of you may not. I was raped by my grandfather at the age of 13. Prior to that, I didn't have an unhealthy relationship to food. I had a very healthy relationship to food. From that point, after my experience, my parents rejected what had happened to me. And I was told not to say anything for the very simple reason that we didn't want to upset my grandmother. We didn't want to upset the family. And so even though I was believed, before I was believed, I was humiliated. And then I was believed. And then I was told to keep quiet. And what then began to occur for me was an addiction to food. And so I gained weight in my 13th and 14th year, and I continued to gain weight. And my mother was an overweight woman, and she had a great deal of shame surrounding her fat and her body. And when I started to gain weight, there were times when she was really very brutal. I remember one point in time when she was doing my hair. I don't even remember what it was for. I think it was for my sister's wedding. It's coming back to me now. And there were stretch marks on my legs, and my mother went crazy. And she was a violent woman, and she was in one of her manic episodes. So it wasn't a very positive experience, obviously, right? So the mental health aspect of my addiction came into play here. And it wasn't until many years later when I was listening to lectures by Marion Woodman, she passed on earlier this year. She was a Jungian analyst, and she had battled anorexia and eating disorder for many years, and she grew to understand relationship to food. And it was through her work that it dawned on me that food was a substitute for a mother. Food became my nurturer. Food became my comforter. Food became my number. And so I have dealt with the spirit of addiction in my own life. And at times I conquer the spirit of addiction. And when I get super, super stressed, I return to old behaviors. Cognitive behavioral therapy was really positive for me, worked very well for me. And so there's components to the spirit of addiction. Where I'm going with this is that it comes oftentimes from a place of trauma, from a place of loss, from my suffering. My addiction to food comes directly from a place of trauma, comes from the place of rejection, comes from the wound of shame, comes from the wound of silence, being forced into silence. So it's a very strong relationship to the formation of my identity as a woman, my identity with the right to say no, my identity with my own body as a sacred temple, as a sacred place. When we come to the place of working with addictions outside of myself, so when I have an individual who comes into my healing space, or I work with individuals such as the people in the drumming circle who were ADAC clients, I began to recognize then that compassion was the most powerful weapon in regards to working with addiction. Gabor Mate is someone that probably many of you know about and has done remarkable work with understanding addiction and understanding the wounds. Why are we numbing? What is beneath the numbing? And the spirits had taught me about the wounds and about compassion and about the living of addiction prior to when I began to become aware of Gabor Mate's work and his work with compassion and his work with wounding. I find it beautifully synchronistic that what the spirits had taught me with respect to addiction, I was seeing out in the real world with respect to experts in addiction coming through and speaking the same lessons and the same messages with addiction as my spirits had taught me. The day job that I have is I have the ability in my day job to follow patterns, familial patterns. So I will have an opportunity to look through a person's history from a social services perspective, and oftentimes then get a glimpse into the family history. And at other times, I work with information with regard to dangerous offenders, and with regard to historical information for dangerous offenders, the historical information relating to their childhood. So my job is as an overseer, from that perspective, right? I'm just looking at it from a spiritual perspective, an overseer of trauma or family lines or family work. When I first got this job many years ago, and I knew that when I stepped into this job to me became a prayer of compassion. And I think I was the first person in my office to have an altar in, showing up in space. And I had objects there that were directly related to compassion, including the goddess Kuan Yin, who from my perspective is the goddess of compassion. And I prayed over top of, and I still pray over top of the work that comes into my office. I don't know if it makes a difference, but I know that the prayers of compassion that I have, this may be the only time this child, this adult, this family had considerate, compassionate, loving, kind prayers said. I don't know, but that's an absolute possibility. The prayers of compassion in this job allow me, I think, then to have less cynicism than perhaps individuals who may not look at trauma with compassion. If I hadn't already been on the path of dealing with trauma and meeting trauma with compassion and meeting hatred with, acceptance, not love, because, I'm not really an opposites kind of person. But that's a whole other story. So when we come to this place of working with the family line, we often come to a place of understanding where trauma is. So the spirit of addiction, when we have this large swell of information on lineage trauma, healing the family trauma, which is something that shamanism has looked at for millennia, and what my experience in my years of working with shamanism, with my spirits, with the wheel, with human beings, with wounds, it is definitely that recognizing family lineage. And we have many traditions that speak about the generations back, the generations forward. I've spoken in my Soul Retrieval podcast about going back various generations in order to find the soul piece that originally was lost. At times, I go back many generations in order to retrieve the initial wound, or to heal the initial wound. And then from healing the initial wound, come forward. And it's very interesting, the information that comes, because the spirit of addiction is very alive and well in family lines. And you can see that when you begin to journey back to the original wounding. What you also see are patterns of mental illness. The patterns of mental illness that follow us coincide with that spirit of addiction. And then some of the behaviors as well, and some of the woundings come through. So many generations of sexual abuse, many generations of sexual assault, many generations of physical assault. So we see these wounds arise. And from a shamanic perspective, from my perspective, it leaves us with a divot or a concave within our energy space that I think is a prime opportunity for attachments. Now, don't freak out. Don't say, oh my God, I have addictions in my family, therefore, oh my God, I have an attachment on me, I better get it off. That's partly what I'm talking about. But what I'm talking about can also come in the form of attachments from a neurochemical perspective, an emotional perspective, a spiritual perspective, an intellectual perspective. We become attached to the idea, for me, I became attached to the idea that food was a nurturer. the opioid crisis, the fentanyl crisis. There's where I live in Edmonton, my understanding is there is, unless you're very well off, there's virtually no heroin in the city, and absolutely everything is fentanyl. So it is a huge industry of money. So now we have the addiction of money, and now we have the addiction to power. And now we have the addiction to darkness, or we have a relationship to darkness. We have a relationship to no morals, quasi-morals, semi-morals, that relationship. We have a relationship between chemist and chemistry. We have a relationship. See all of these relationships? They all come into play. So the attachments that you experience come into play because of all of the domino pieces, all of the pieces that have to come together in order to make an addiction stick. When we work with compassion, when we work with the spirit of addiction, one of the first things that I move in my tract, in the later years, certainly not in the beginning years. In the beginning years, how I worked with the spirit of addiction, or why I call it a living, breathing spirit, is because when I would do soul retrieval work, or when I would do extraction work, I would encounter the addiction as a living, breathing being. And some of you will remember a podcast that I did a couple of years ago, and some of you may not. I think it's called Nightmares, Bad Dreams, whatever it is. Anyway, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is this. What I encountered in doing journey work for an innocent baby was a horde of spirits racing towards this baby that were directly related to the family that the child had come from. And what is very interesting from my perspective is, so let me continue on with the spirit of addiction. One of the hordes of spirits that was racing towards this child, that we were trying to build a protection around this child, was the spirit of addiction. So the mother was an addict, the grandmother was an addict, many of the mother's siblings were addicts as well. And so the spirit of addiction was going to come straight through to this little one. It has no choice but to come straight through to this little one because it's an open avenue. It's a family lineage. It's a family trauma. It's a family coping mechanism. It's a family relationship. Relationships aren't always good. Relationships, there's all sorts of facets to relationship. I haven't talked about, but you've heard talk about codependency. How many addicts are in relationships with addicts? And that horrible dependency relationship that occurs. So there's a wounding of abandonment. There's a wounding of misunderstanding. There's a wounding of, not good enough. So how do we deal with the spirit of addiction if we don't first attempt to understand what it is that is creating the space for addiction? So as a practitioner, even as an individual who is struggling with their own addictions, to journey back to the place in your life, the time in your life. Ask yourself a question. This is just an example. When was the last time you felt safe? When was the last time you felt unconditional love? When was the last time you felt acceptance? And journey back to that time. And you may feel, when I ask those questions, you may feel never. And I too have had the experience where I've said never. However, I was able to journey back, and much to my surprise, I really was able to find a small piece of myself that remembered what it was like to feel safe. When I merged with that 2-year-old self that still felt safe, I was able to bring safety back into this timeline, my present timeline, and it changed how I related to other people. And it still changes how I related to other people. And I was able to do many shifts in my life for negative behaviors or thoughts, because no matter how long you've been at this work, we still have more work to do. I still have more work to do. Maybe you don't. I don't know. I don't know you. But I think we are forever unwinding ourselves and understanding ourselves. So in dealing with that aspect of the living, breathing spirits chasing down that little one, that living, breathing spirit of addiction is wound up with a whole other series of addictions and wounds, behaviors, thought patterns, etc., etc., etc. So where do we see ourselves? How do we go here? How do we move with the spirit of addiction? I, as a practitioner, I like to first do a compassionate depossession, because I think that that's very important, because with the spirit of addiction, what I've learned is oftentimes it comes with a being, a suffering being who also was an addict, or who is menacing, or who has negative thoughts. Remember when we talked about earlier, we talked about the various impacts or the various attachments that are required, or the divots or the concaves within an energy system, within our own bodies, that different things attach to, and then we have the perfect storm for that spirit of addiction to attach and that spirit of addiction to move through the body. And along with that perfect storm can often come a suffering being who fits one of those divots, one of those concaves, one of those aspects of being, or even the spirit of addiction in and of itself. So when I get the opportunity to do compassionate depossession, oftentimes there are spirits that first have to go. And then I do the soul retrieval, and then I bring back the pieces, and then they meet their own pieces, and then we start the long process of integration. But if we can release a suffering being, if indeed that's in your practice, and if indeed that's something that you accept as reality or not, that for me is one of the first steps. But there are many other ways to deal with it. That's just mine. There are other treatments and other forms of working with it. And it's challenging. If you're a family member, or a very close family member has a really severe addiction, it's challenging to remain in a place of compassion and love when they say horrible things, or you really want them to change and they can't change. And so part of the cycle of addiction is the projection of our negativity, and the projection of our expectations, and the projection of our you've disappointed me, our own shame on the addict. So as family members, we don't always accept the addict into the family. We don't always accept that addict has aspects of attachment that we don't understand. Maybe they have disorganized attachment. Maybe they have unhealthy attachment. And so if they have a fear of rejection, family members constantly reject the addict. It's very challenging to love an addict. It's very challenging to love a hardcore addict. It's challenging. It's challenging to love someone who at that moment really doesn't love themselves, and at that moment doesn't believe they're worthy or capable of receiving love. So the spirit of addiction not only deteriorates and destroys the human being, trauma is something that happens to you and it affects your whole life, but trauma doesn't have to be a life sentence. Addiction doesn't have to be a life sentence. I'm not saying that sobriety is easy or long-term sobriety is easy. I don't know anything about that. I've been very fortunate not to have, I've had an acceptable addiction. My acceptable addiction is to food. But if I was an alcoholic, that's an unacceptable addiction. If I was addicted to hard drugs, that's an unacceptable addiction. So we have various degrees of addiction even within our society. What's an acceptable addiction? What's not an acceptable addiction? Workaholics oh, that's an industrious human being. Actually, no, he's a workaholic. She's a workaholic, and will throw away the entire family and all relationships just for that specific relationship to work. So that feeling, whatever generates, the workaholic. But that's an acceptable addiction. But if there is an addiction to crack cocaine, that's not an acceptable addiction. That's a dirty addiction. So even in our overculture's view of addiction, you can see how challenging it is to get out of the wheel of shadow and into the wheel of light when society projects even more shadow. Society projects even more hatred, even more, just vile things. Some of the things on the internet that speak to addiction, because we are in the forefront of a huge addiction for, fentanyl and the opium crisis, or the opiate crisis, whatever you want to call it, killing thousands of people. And now we have a society of fear. So now fentanyl wins again, because we now have a fear that fentanyl is going to come to us. It's going to come to our family. It's got 4,000 people. It's going to come to my family. So we now have even more pressure on the cycle and shadow of that addiction. Remember, we took it apart earlier and we looked at fentanyl. And so the relationship between the chemical and the chemist, the relationship between the dealer and the buyer, the relationship between the distributor and the buyer, the relationship between the producer and the consumer. So there are very different relationships. What occurred within those chemists that they recognized such a profitable addiction that it slowly was meted out and then all of a sudden snowballed out into our society. I didn't even hear of fentanyl until Michael Jackson died. And then I didn't hear about it for a while. And then all of a sudden, it's a big addiction. Whereas crack cocaine and meth were much bigger addictions from prior to that. And again, we force our own shadow, we force our own fear, we force our own misunderstanding all upon the addict. So not only does the addict have to deal with their own neurochemical dependency, emotional dependency, spiritual dependency, and intellectual dependency on this nefarious chemical, we have all of the shadows coming upon that addict. So the addict has to lift even higher than their own addiction in order to get out of it. It is like the alcoholic in the streets, how much social pressure there is to rise out of that. And many of the homeless alcoholics, some of them are out there for 20 years, 25 years, 10 years. I don't even know how you would survive homeless and an alcoholic for 10 years, because that's not my reality. How do we come back into this place of compassion when we are bred through our mainstream media, through our mainstream society to dislike, distrust, and find the addict a dirty human being? How do we step into compassion? How do we step past our prejudices? How do we step into that place of understanding? If I hadn't experienced working with addiction so early on in my shamanic journey, I don't know if I would have a relationship and an understanding for addiction to this day that I do have. And I don't always have a positive relationship to addicts simply because of the destruction that I see from a familial perspective with respect to this addiction. But when I stop my judgment and I stand out of the place of judgment and I stand in the place of compassion and understanding, then my eyes open wider. So instead of having a 110-degree view of reality, perhaps now I can have a 180-degree view of reality if I step into a place of compassion and understanding the wounds. And by doing so, by broadening my understanding and my peripheral vision, I can understand the smaller aspects, all the tumbling aspects that come into making and creating the addiction. When I talk about soul retrieval work, I often talk about it takes a community to destroy a child, and it takes a community to build a child, to repair a child. It takes a community to create an addict, and it takes a community to heal an addict. It takes training to be anesthetized to our life. So sleepwalkers, somnambulism. It takes steps and training to be a somnambulist. It takes steps and training to be awake, to be part of the awoke reality. It takes steps of taking off the blinders. It takes steps of taking off the layers of the heart and recognizing, especially if you're in a situation where a family member is suffering with addiction, to recognize that you're going to not always stand in the place of compassion and understanding, because you too have expectations, and you too want success, and you too, etc., etc., etc. How do we come back from that? Where is our journey? Where is our journey as healers? Where is our journey as the one seeking healing? Our journey has to start with the most basic of understanding. Whatever that basic is for you. I don't know what that basic is for you. Is that basic recognizing that there are many forms of addiction and some have shadow and some do not? Is your base understanding that there are wounds that you can't see, but perhaps you can try to understand, you can maybe do a little more? Or is your base just to turn an eye from it and say, you know what, it's not my world, so I don't really care. And I have no judgment on you if that's your reality. If you live in a world where there is no addiction and you have nothing around you, you are blessed. I think you're really, really blessed. My job deals with working with individuals who have various addictions, and not only addictions, but then mental health issues, and not only mental health issues. Then we're dealing with neurochemistry, and we're dealing with the psychological aspects. So if you don't see or work with the some of the shadowier aspects of society, I think that's brilliant. I think we need people who have the light or who have a different viewpoint than us to continue to shed their light forward and shine their light forward. Because some of us who are in the trenches, some of us who are working and do have this as part of our life, we can seek that beacon and know that there is hope out there. There are people who are not experiencing what we're experiencing. So if I have a patient come in and the patient has an addiction or works with addiction in the family, then I try to be a pillar of hope and say there are, and show them what the hope is, whether that hope is returning hope. Many times in soul retrieval work, one of the things that is stolen from a child is hope. And some of the most fundamental soul retrievals return hope. Some of the most fundamental soul retrievals include returning light back to people. That's astounding. And sometimes there are even relationships to the soul before the soul even entered into this life, where a piece of the soul was stuck in what I just see as the golden chute. That's what I call it. I don't know what other people call it, but I'm a practical woman with a pragmatic viewpoint. So, hey, it's a chute. People are born, they come down a chute. That's the way it goes. And what I've encountered is the pieces of soul that, you see kids and they're in the slides and they have their hands and their feet out, so they're stopping, and that's kind of what I see in the chute, is hands out, feet out, going no, and so a piece of the soul gets stuck. And that piece may be innocence. That piece may be trust. That piece, when it looked down into the life and thought, oh, I know what I'm getting into, and then actually looked had the life and said, fuck no, I'm not going down there. You can't make me. No, wait, water's cold, water's cold. No. And then along I come so many years later and go, yo, motherfucker, what are you doing up in that chute? Get on down here. I'm not quite like that. I'm usually, more compassionate. But, if you're not laughing, then you don't really, then I guess we have a different sense of humor. Again, my jaded reality comes into play, but I digress. I think that I have a responsibility in this lifetime to understand addiction. I have a responsibility in this life to stand in the place of compassion. I have a responsibility in this life to step out of the place of judgment. It's not always easy. It's not always pretty. It's not always fun, but it is a necessity. Standing outside of judgment is a necessity. Standing in the place of compassion for me is a necessity. Opening my peripheral vision to take a more encompassing view is essential for me. It is essential for me because if I don't, then I too become another victim or a secondary victim to the spirit of addiction. I then become weighted down by the spirit of addiction, even just by spiritual osmosis. The only way that I can work with addiction is if I stand with a warmer glow and a warmer energy than that warm hug of addiction. That warm, tingly feeling of fentanyl going through your lungs or going through the veins. That warm, tingly scotch going down the body. That lovely drag of a cigarette going into your lungs. The 180 kilometers an hour in a 100 zone. The etc., etc., etc. So many faces to addiction. So many aspects and facets to the spirit of addiction. I don't understand everything by any stretch of the imagination, but I do understand that I can't conquer addiction through fighting. I can not make headway with hatred, with anger. I can't. I can't force a person to seek sobriety. I can't. But I can express love and compassion. I can listen to a mother, a brother, a sister, a father, an uncle, a grandparent who is struggling with a loved one with addiction. I can give encouragement. I may even give advice if I'm asked for it. But if I'm not asked for advice, I'm not going to give it to you. It is a really intense challenge that we face. Is the rise of addiction based on the rise of hopelessness? Is the rise of addiction in direct correlation to the rise of numbing behaviors? I don't know. We haven't even touched on the campfire of the nation, which is television, and the hours and hours of addiction that many people have to that. And we don't even look at that or talk about that very much. But that numbing, that campfire of the nation, seeking someone else to tell us a story so we don't have to think about our own, is real. It's valid. So I want to leave you with an ending that I don't think I've ever led you with. And I just want to end off with a prayer. And so to the spirits of the north, the south, the east, the west, for all I see and for all I cannot, I send a prayer to the spirit of addiction. And I see you in my heart. I see you with my eyes. I see you with my voice. I feel you with my body. And I see you in all your magnitude. I see you in your darkness. I see you in the light. I see you as a towering being, and I see you as a cowering ant. I know you have many faces, many facets, and many aspects. To the spirit of addiction, I send out this gentle call. Know that I'm coming for you, and I see you, and I will talk to you, and I will help you if you ask. However, I also send out a prayer of strength and warrior strength, the strength of the gods and the goddesses, the strength of all the beings, to empower the constant listener, the semi-listener, the brand new listener, to stand in your own power, to stand in your own light, to stand in the spirit of compassion, to stand in a place of understanding for self, and to turn the light that you would have to shed on other people for healing, turn it on your own self. View your own self with love. View your own self with compassion. My prayer is that you see yourself for who you are and not for the projections of others. These are my prayers. Hi. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your space. And I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.